Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 59 of Nostalgia Talk. Holy God, just hearing 59 is so weird because that means we're one show away from 60, and it's only been, 6 months since episode number 50, and that one was huge. Whoa, that's, oh, God. I'm trying hard not to faint as I say that. Anyway, so welcome to episode number 59 of Nostalgia Talk. I'm James. You know me. You know me well. You know what I'm into. And joining me this time is the one and only Tad Stones. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'm glad you didn't have to faint there. That would have been very awkward.
It would have been really awkward. It's my fault for
A lot of
saying,
dead air.
yeah, it's
A lot of dead air, and I couldn't like give you any sort of, aid through the computer screen. So all
yeah.
good.
Yeah, it definitely would have been weird, but it's my fault for saying that we're one show away from 60. But anyway, so for anybody who
There you
doesn't
go.
know, Tad Stones is an animator. He's done a lot of work with Disney. He worked on Adventures of Gummi Bears. He created Darkwing Duck. I think co-created Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. Am I correct on that?
You are correct.
Okay, co-created Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, and the animated series of Aladdin and Hercules. Now, these are shows that some of them were a little bit before my time, but I watched a lot of them endlessly as a kid. Like I remember Darkwing Duck and wanting to be like Darkwing Duck, and I remember Buzz Lightyear of Star Command because I'm a Toy Story kid. So this is really an honor to be talking to you today. It really is.
Well, good. Hope I can tell you something interesting.
Well,
We'll see how your questions go.
well, not just me, our listeners. You know,
Oh, no.
our listeners are really
Excellent.
are really the ones who are probably going to be learning a lot. I mean, me too, but this is for the people. So let's
All right.
begin. Let's begin by going back in time a little bit. How did you become inspired to get into animation?
Um, I growing up, my dad wanted to be a cartoonist. He never was able to because he got out of college uh, right in the Depression, and he kind of took the job that you could get. Uh, but he had a huge influence on me in two ways when it came to getting into animation. He had the famous artist cartoonist course, which is this fantastic book of Milt Caniff and Al Capp and all these classic guys who did comic strips when comic strips were like a huge deal. I mean, Al Capp, who did Little Abner, was on the cover of Time, I think, twice. Milt Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon, was on the cover of Time, and they both had radio shows and either a TV show or a play about their stuff. So comic strip artists used to be this huge media thing. Everybody read them, and that would help sell papers depending on what comic you had. I think the last time that happened was with Calvin and Hobbes. They'd always make sure he was on the front of the Sunday paper, along with Peanuts. Anyway, so I grew up with these how-to books on how to draw cartoons, basically, in terms of comic strips and all that, and then got a book on how to do animation. But the two other things that he did, aside from having his library and encouragement, um, he worked for Carnation Company um, in the Friskies division, but they also delivered milk back then. And Carnation had a huge tie-in with Disneyland. On Main Street, they had a Carnation Cafe and all that. And because of that, the company picnic each year was at Disneyland. So I was literally born across the street. I mean, literally, as in, I could see the studio, the gates, if I was opening my eyes and could lift my head. Anyway, so I was immersed in Disney early on, growing up in Burbank. Um, at Disneyland, I got the Art of Animation book. They had an Art of Animation exhibit, and then the Bob Thomas Art of Animation book, which covered Sleeping Beauty, but took you through the entire animation process of doing a feature film. So it's something I always wanted to do. I started collecting comics. I like comic art too. And, I was right there at the beginning of the Marvel age. And about the time I hit high school, I loved animation. I grew up seeing reruns of all the Warner Brothers classics, and even what I later realized were silent film cartoons that were then, given a soundtrack so that television could just churn them out. Because I was born in 1952, and in the 50s it was like television was this huge new thing, but they needed programming, so they, grab anything they could get and repurpose. Anyhow, so I had all the background, but in high school, I just figured, like, you know what? The only place worth working, in my opinion at the time, for what I wanted to do was Disney Studios, because although Hanna-Barbera and Filmation and there were, a dozen studios turning out Saturday morning type animation, I recognized as being limited animation, and I really loved that full animated Disney thing. So I felt like, well, I'd love to get into animation, but they have their guys, and they're still there doing the animation, and they're the only place in town. So I kind of, that moved off my radar. I went to college and ultimately found out that through the sweet mate of my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, is that Disney had a training program, and that what I thought was basically true at the time. So about the time I was in high school, they weren't thinking of training for the future. And then they turned out some movies that started making a lot of money, at least in terms of those days. And they said, management said to the animators, what plans have you made for training a new generation? And they hadn't made any plans, because Roy Disney Sr., from day one, after they had done like 7 features, he said, that's enough. We can just recycle these every 7 years or something. And Walt said, no, we got to keep at this. So they put together a training program, which was basically Eric Larson, one of Disney's famous 9 old men. And basically you would submit your portfolio. And this is what happened to me. I went in, I called up for information. And at the end of the phone call, he said, when do we want to come in? How about next Thursday? And it's like, I wasn't even an art major at the time. I'd started an art major, and then I got a lot of input about my writing from all my English teachers. And I found this other major called humanities that seemed to combine my interest in art and writing. I ended up never taking a writing class, and all my art turned into like 3D art, like sculpture, ceramics, and all of that. The ceramics paid off because suddenly, after that phone call, I needed to make a portfolio. And the ceramics teacher that I was the TA for took over the art department for that year, because the head of the art department was on sabbatical, and he loved Disney. He could do the goofy yell, and
You mean,
he arranged it. Yeah, exactly, that one. So anyway, he arranged for me to go to, sit in on life drawing classes and things like that, so I could quickly do the kind of sketches they wanted. So I went in, showed them the stuff. They thought there was promise there, but they said, we need more action sketches and all that, and things of people in movement and all that. I went back. I thought they meant immediately, where later on when I was there, I realized some people come in and then 6 months later they submit again. But I basically watched this before tape,
right.
home tape anyway. So I couldn't record things and analyze them. So I watched a lot of, basketball games and things like that. I kind of cheated, because I was not a sports guy, but the other guys in the dorm had Sports Illustrated magazines, and I would look at those shots and say, okay, he captured the certain flow. And even going back to that cartoonist course, they had a cartoonist called Willard Mullen who would do these sports drawings where he'd really stretch out the figures and exaggerate the motions, which is exactly what you want to do in animation. So I took that knowledge, I looked at these still drawings, I kept watching, trying to catch the action of the sports players, and brought in all these sketches the following week. So that really worked to my advantage, because one, I showed I could do a lot of sketches in a short amount of time, which is what an animator has to do. And they liked the way I captured the action in my quick sketches. And they actually said, "Oh, we never thought people could do that," and again, before VHS. But it was just the fact that I stared at a TV screen and did sketching, where I guess they were thinking back in the old days, you get a model, you go to the zoo or something like that. I was in a college dorm room, looking at a 10-inch screen or something, whatever portable TV we had. So again, when people ask me how to get into animation, I say, "Oh, fall in love with somebody who knows somebody whose father works at Disney." Anyway, that's the connection I made. I got in, and basically, you then go in and you have like 8 weeks. I always get this mixed up whether it had to have been 8 weeks and 8 weeks. Whatever, you had to do a personal test of just animation, and at least I had that background of the How to Animate book by Preston Blair and all the Disney stuff I had. But for somebody who was coming in cold, that you basically had to learn how to animate while you're animating a test that's going to determine whether you have a job or not. Anyway, I survived the first group, then did a second one, and was accepted in. And I basically showed my second test the same day that Ron Clements did his, it's not on the internet, his famous Cruella de Vil test. He did a test of Cruella de Vil because he loved 101 Dalmatians, walking down an alley, and there was Horace, this short guy of 101 Dalmatians, just leaning on a trash can, and she slips in water and falls on her butt. And Horace would laugh, and then she slammed him on the head with a garbage pail or a garbage can lid. And it was fantastic. It was, without exaggeration, feature quality. And that's what the guys of the review board were, in essence, most of the 9 old men, plus Ken Anderson, head of story and top layout guys. And they looked at this stuff and they thought that could have been in the feature. And that's how good it was. So I did this test that I did very well on. And the next morning, because I was in a room with Ron and other trainees, and they came in, they said, "Here are the animation geniuses," and went right to Ron. And Frank Thomas snapped him up to be his assistant, or not his, basically for him to mentor. Because Ron, they said, he can animate now.
Like an
now
apprentice.
We want to get into it. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. He would actually start animating on the feature, whereas normally once you survive those tests, you, as I did, you then become an in-betweener, which I was terrible at. Anyway, I had lunch with Ron not too long ago. I came in basically after Ron Clements, director of Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Moana and everything in between.
A lot of my favorite Disney movies. Yeah,
I came in 6 months after Ron, and then like 3 months before Glenn Keane. So that was my little window. So that's a longer version of basically it was being immersed in Disney from the beginning. Plus, my dad worked at Carnation Company, as I mentioned. But the other thing, besides the company picnic, he brought home a stationery that was used in marketing. Well, the back of that stationery, once I had a campaign like, buy 12 cases of Frisky's dog food and you'll get an Indian headdress, which was actually one I remember. Well, after that campaign is over, there's all this leftover stationery. Well, the back is this pristine white paper. So my dad would bring home literally reams of that paper. So I always had drawing paper, so I could, it wasn't precious to me. It was the opposite. Ron growing up in Kansas City, or Sioux City, excuse me. He had, his mom was a single parent, and every once in a while they'd get a little pack of typing paper, and he used every little inch of that and drew on paper bags and things like that. But Ron did pretty well for himself. So actually, people don't realize how good an animator Ron is, because he very quickly moved into directing and writing on the Little Mermaid.
Yeah, he's made a lot of success with those films.
Oh yeah,
Hmm. So you were always interested in Disney from the beginning, and got started in through there. How did you get? And then did you get to work on their TV shows at the time? Because I think the Disney Channel was somewhat new.
There was no Disney TV animation
Okay.
until I was, let's put it this way. Um, I was actually picked by Ron Miller, who was president of the company before Michael Eisner came, to investigate the idea of doing television. And but Disney had just gone through a strike, and even though they had the right to send animation overseas, um, Ron didn't want to do that. And in fact, there was this insane part where I had a meeting with some other guys with Marvel Studios at the time who were doing animation because they already had um, contacts overseas. So the idea that Disney would do shows and then give them to Marvel, it's like you're just giving Marvel money, you know. So one executive who had always said Disney should get into TV animation came and had a meeting with me, and he says, "Okay." And what he saw it as being is basically the Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck show, or Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, where they just use old cartoons and put them out there.
Yeah, I grew
Uh,
up with that,
and I said,
but it was
"No."
called.
Well, yeah, exactly.
But I
But we
think
were
when I grew up
expressly
with it, it was
told,
called the
"No,
Bugs
no,
Bunny and
you can't
Tweety
do
show.
this."
Yeah,
Yeah, it went through several incarnations.
yeah.
Um, anyway, I said, "Oh, that we're expressly not allowed to do that. We can't use the old stuff." And the guy just saying, because he knew the economics were, if you can't do this and you're not going overseas, you can't do animation. So that went nowhere. It just so happens I was part of that. When Michael Eisner came, and Michael started in Saturday morning television at ABC, I guess. Um, and so he was wide open. His philosophy was, everywhere Disney is the biggest name in animation, and everywhere there's animation, Disney should be there. But we should always be the best in each of that. So in other words, he didn't expect television animation to look like feature animation, but it should be the best of television animation and all that. So he had a meeting at his house on Sunday at the end of his first week at Disney. So that's the high priority he put on it. Anyway, they gathered together like 10 guys, and I was technically on vacation. And I got a call saying, "We know you're on vacation. Would you mind coming to Michael Eisner's house for a meeting about television animation?" Because of the people were there were actually from more the licensing division and marketing, because they had always looked into television, and I had done a project for them, at least through storyboard. So they knew me well. But to sell products, all they had was these movies that used to come out every 5 years or so. And if you wanted to sell anything in between, you needed to be in television and specials or something. So because of my connection with them, and basically they were part of that push to get into television, I got invited. And I brought in one of the projects I had kind of boarded for, Mickey and the Space Pirates. And Michael loved that, but he said, "No, Mickey is too important. You have to make sure you can really carry that off before getting it." So I thought his instincts about animation were pretty good. And at that point, the weird thing at that meeting, he said, it's not like we were throwing out a lot of ideas for specific shows. Other than I had brought that stuff. But he said, "You know what? My kids just came back from camp and they couldn't stop talking about this candy called Gummi Bears." And he says, "I swear you do a show called that and it'll be a hit." So I remember in the his parking lot, basically outside his house, um, I was saying, "God, he seems pretty sharp and everything, except for that gummy bear idea. It's like saying, let's do a show called Pepperoni People." Um, anyway, I didn't go back to the studio because I wasn't in the department of the other guys. So I went wherever I was at the time, which I'm not sure why they were even paying me at that point. Um, but they started working on the Gummy Bear ideas, and at first it was very much a Candyland type game. I think the villain was Licorice Whip or something like that. And they were even, and this sounds crazy, He-Man, when he came out, used to have a moral at the end of every episode to kind of keep the critics off his back. They actually considered it, imagine at the end of each cartoon, they were going to have a dental hygiene bit, because they're worried about basing it on a candy.
Oh,
Finally,
that's
Art
a good
Vitello
idea.
and yeah, well, that was back when it was literally a Candyland type game.
Hmm.
Uh, anyway, Art Vitello and Jim Magon got together, and they really working together, created the Gummy Bears. Basically taking a lot from Asterix and Obelix, and just Jim naturally made it more like mini Disney features, which I think set kind of the standard of most of our shows back then. I mean, all of our shows, I think, back then were comedy adventures. It's just the needle would either go more comedy or more adventure, depending on the show. Um, anyway, so they did Gummy Bears, and at that time, I was actually considering, because I was kind of aimless at the studio at the time. Uh, I was considering leaving Disney, and I saw Michael Webster, who was co-president or a president, I guess, of the new division at the time. And I said, Michael, do you guys do freelance storyboarding? Because I thought, like, if I could make enough money storyboarding freelance, and I didn't even really know what television storyboarding is like versus what I did when I was at feature animation, because I had moved out of animation into story. Um, anyway, he said, "Oh, well, you don't want to do that. Why don't you come visit?" And I had forgotten they had wanted me day one, and I hadn't gone. Um, and I went to where they were, and it was just one hallway long, where they were doing Wuzzles and Gummy Bears, and met the guys I didn't know, and he was saying, like, "Yeah, Dad may be coming over here." It was like, "What?" I didn't say that, but I didn't contradict him. Um, anyway, they made me an offer. I ended up, basically, long story short, went over there technically as an executive. It's called, I think my title was creative manager or something. Um, but then, so I was there like 9 months after they started. So the
Okay.
Gummy Bears had episodes coming back, Whistles had episodes back, but they weren't, it wasn't like the whole season was completed or anything. Um, anyway, so that's I was right there at the beginning of TV animation, and then in the third season of Gummy Bears, NBC wanted to change. Didn't want to work with Jim Magon anymore, because basically Jim came in with no animation experience, which kind of took him aback. And Disney kind of said, "Look, this is our guy." Um, and Jim was very passionate and argumentative about the way he felt the shows should go, which,
Yeah, I've met him.
to
He
his
is very
credit,
passionate.
were
Yeah.
more, yeah, and to his credit, it made it more unique than what was out there, because he resisted the notes that made it like any other show. Um, anyway, so I ended up suddenly story editor on the third season, and then ultimately co-producer on that season with Alan Zaslov. And I love the 22-minute episodes, because I always, again, my feature background, told a longer story with that I enjoyed, really the fantasy adventure side of things. Um, and after that, meanwhile, I was pitching ideas when we had the Gong shows with Michael and Jeffrey Katzenberg, and basically where you pitch a bunch of shows with like one or two lines to see if there's interest there. Um, and it was then, for instance, we pitched Rescue Rangers, and it was Michael Eisner who said they liked the show, they didn't like the lead character. He wasn't defined enough. And as we moved on with the meeting, we were talking about DuckTales and the other Disney classic characters. It was Michael who said, "Put those chipmunks in that show." And suddenly we walked out of the meeting, instead of them, develop that more with a green light to go. And that's sort of Rescue Rangers. And then Jim and I basically, I wrote the Bible based on discussions Jim and I had back and forth. And then we were kind of the two creative leads in story anyway at TV, and our boss Gary Kreisel said, "You both can't be on the same show." He
Oh.
said, basically. So Jim became the executive giving notes, which ultimately caused friction down the line because I was doing the show under tremendous production pressure. I was doing the show on the run. It was practically stream of consciousness, and Jim was
Ooh.
giving notes, and he saw it going a different way. And ultimately, I was taken off the show,
Oh
which was
God.
fine. I needed the rest, and that gave me a chance to develop Darkwing Duck, which was one of the high points of my career.
Mm. But with Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, like, how is it the idea to make Chip and Dale, like, because they are such doofuses in the original cartoons, and in
Well,
Chip and
certainly
Dale,
Dale is.
yeah, I remember going to Disney World like many years ago, and Chip and Dale were there, and I was like, Dale's the dumbass, and I think the person in
Well,
costume as Dale. I think the person in costume as Dale heard me, and you know how those chipmunks can be whenever they feel insulted. So Dale just
yeah,
crosses his arms and does the fast foot tap that they usually do. Like, would you just call me?
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Well, actually, I talked about the Gong Show, and that's an old reference to a show that used to be on TV where you had three comedians as judges, and then the act would come on. They'd have like 30 seconds to start their singing or juggling or whatever they did, and they'd have more time. But after 30 seconds, if they didn't like them, they could hit this giant gong, and a hook would come out and drag people off stage. Um, so what we called the Gong Show was you had to show up again with the top executives of the company, um, and you pitched what's called log lines from an old TV log. It would just be a short description of the show. So I remember there was what was it, Trojan birds and Legionnaire cats, and it was just the idea of the Battle of Troy, but Troy would basically be up in these giant trees, and the cats are always trying to get to the birds. And it would have been just a gag show on like Roadrunner Coyote type of thing. Thank God it did the sell, because I don't know how we would do an entire season of that. Anyway, it was that short. And I know one time we pitched 22, 23 shows, and 18 of them were mine, of just spitting out ideas like that. Well, one of the successes of that, Ken Kuntz, David Weimer's a writing team at the time who had done Wuzzles, pitched Miami Mice, because Miami Vice was huge at the time. They instantly loved the clever name, which they were all about. They felt like you have to do a quality show, but if you have a clever name or a funny name that's intriguing in some way, you'll get an initial audience, and then it's up to you to keep them. So they loved that. But very quickly, as we developed it, we changed the name. I don't know that I got a call from legal, but we knew it would come. So we called it Metro Mice.
Yeah,
And
I think
so,
that Sesame Street also did something called Miami Mice at the time.
yeah, that would be it. Yeah. I mean, you can get away with it because it's parody type of stuff. So it's one of those things where you legally can do it, but you don't want to, you don't want to muddy the waters before you even get started.
Right.
Anyway, it was developed by Jim and I and Carl Gears. Carl, who later did the Winnie the Pooh TV show series. So we got it even to script. And it was just weird because we were basically doing, a cop show, but on the mouse level. And it's like, you watch most cop shows and it involves killing people generally. It's a murder they're investigating or something like that. And we were going to do what? We're going to rob a jewelry store every week. And I even found some artwork recently, and it was like these mice with guns, and they look like real guns. They weren't like a big rubber darts. And all I could do is like, what were we thinking back then? Anyway, that didn't go anywhere, but it still, that turned into, it can't just be mice cops. I mean, at a meeting, the rescuers, that was the first feature I worked on. We pitched rescuers because it was designed from a book series, so why not make a series of the rescuers? But that's when the movie sequel was underway, and Jeffrey said, "No, make this show your rescuers." And ultimately, we ended up going that way in a closer way. We came up with the name Rescue Rangers just as a general adventure group that would help, people and or animals in trouble. And it was similar to our final group, but you had a single lead. So when Chip and Dale were put into it, that changed the dynamics, because at most in a team you want, and I know shows like the X-Men don't follow this rule, but we tried to have no more than 5 characters, because in a 22-minute show, and certainly if you're doing a show shorter than that, everybody needs camera time. They need things to say or whatever. And you figure you have a group of 4 or 5. Well, then you're going to have a villain who may have henchmen, and then you're going to also have whoever the person is, the victim, whoever they're helping. You just have too many people on screen. So by adding 2 guys in, we had to prune down what we had. We used to have an eagle that they flew around on. That was replaced by the Ranger plane. Gadget stayed. She invented the Ranger plane. Monterey Jack was there. He used to be called Billabong, and we made him more of a world traveling mouse. Zipper was still there. We had an Asian cricket, and he went. We had a chameleon. She could do plaid, but it hurt. And so that it got down to the Rescue Rangers we had because of those 2 guys. Plus, to distinguish the 2, because I always, in the early cartoons, the chipmunks were almost non-distinguishable from each other. And then as the size of Dale's nose grew, he became the slightly sillier one. And I
As
just took
usual.
that and pushed it. Yeah, exactly. I pushed it, farther. And that's why they, the original character that they replaced, Kit Colby, wore this aviator's jacket. And so Chip has that jacket. I forget who put the hat on him, because an Indiana Jones hat. And I kind of was nervous about it because I said, that's really on the nose. But nobody said anything. And even though we kind of in publicity said, yeah, and then Dale is the Magnum PI, it was really because a Hawaiian shirt, and I wear them all the time now, was a little crazier at the time. And it was like going through color models. It was like, oh, we want the red and yellow is a bright color. And Thomas Magnan basically was out there with red Hawaiian shirts. Anyway, so that helped distinguish his Chip being more of the solid leader and Dale being the kind of the goof off, as you'd say.
Yeah.
And then we just went in, we just dove in and came up with characters for them to help, and suck the stories out of the ether and onto the page, and went on from there.
So how did Darkwing Duck come about? Because I'm a big Darkwing Duck kid.
That one has the clearest origin. I mean, as far as the project is, because Jeffrey ordered me to do it. He said, Jeffrey Katzenberg. Again, remember what I said, that they liked intriguing names or joke names.
Right.
Well, DuckTales had done an episode called Double O Duck, and he thought that was a great title. And he said, I want you to do a show called Double O Duck. In the episode, it was Launchpad. His orders were to do Double O Duck. It can't be Launchpad. He said, I want you to create a new character. That was what I was ordered to do. There's another Duck episode, which to this day don't think I've seen. And it's the Midnight Mallard or the Masked Mallard. And it was basically Scrooge McDuck put on a superhero suit for whatever reason. So it was not based on that. Launchpad was never at the start of the show. He was in some of the development as a part of a group. Anyway, I went in and took a shot at Double O Duck, and I was not excited about it because it just seemed like it's going to be a James Bond spoof. And this is before, we'd seen Austin Powers basically had show how you can do that and do an insane way. Uh, anyway, I did a, by the numbers kind of thing, and it didn't really have that Disney heart you expect. And Jeffrey looked at it and said, "Doesn't have the Disney heart. It doesn't have anything to it. It's just a parody." So he agreed with me. Uh, and now I realize how lucky I was, because normally when somebody strikes out on a pitch like that, they give it to somebody else. And instead, he said, "Do it over." Um, so I went in. We had a bunch of story editors and people I wanted to work with or had worked with on staff. Um, Instead of being signed on to do a show, which generally they are now, Disney would hire you for a certain term of however many years, or with an option for more. And the beautiful thing about that is you could be called in to help out on any show, just and I could bring in the guys I wanted to work with on the show if I could sell it. And it was Dwayne Capizzi, who had done the animated Alf show and Jackie Chan Adventures and Men in Black. Anyway, Dwayne was there always. He looked at the early drawings of Double O Duck, which was basically a Donald in a white tuxedo and a mask and a small hat and a cape. And he said, really, looking at this guy, he looks more like a pulp hero, like the Shadow or the Green Hornet. And that was the light bulb over my head, where I knew about that stuff. I was too young to have listened to it on the radio, but because my comic fandom overlapped with my science fiction fandom and basically old radio fandom, I knew about the Shadow and Green Hornet and all that. And that really opened me up more toward certainly leaning heavily toward the superhero, Anyway, the show didn't sell till we added Goslin to it. As Frank Angonis, who did the new version of DuckTales, said, in my first time I met him, we instantly started talking about Darkwing, because that's the show he really wanted to do. Mm-hmm. He said, "Oh, Tad, we know Darkwing is the story of a father and a daughter and a launch pad." And anyway, Goslin was so important to that. And, that's what sold the show, basically. That added the Disney heart, the idea that, later we said, what if Batman had a little girl who refused to stay at home? That was, going on that. Goslin was basically an animated Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes. So that sold the show. We went out and sold it. We made pins and posters and all that. And when I say sold it, it was in syndication. So you sold it to stations all across the country. Right. And got a letter from a guy called Cubby Broccoli, who was the famous producer of all the James Bond films. He said, "We own Double O. It's not a thing. It was created by Ian Fleming, and you can't use it." There had been all sorts of parodies out there. Obviously, DuckTales did one. But the idea that this would be a big deal, because DuckTales was a huge hit, and it would, I don't know if they were worried about tarnishing the name or whatever, they just basically said, "You can't do it." So we had come up with a new name, and we had a contest, and ultimately the contest was won by Alan Burnett, who then went on to do, work with Bruce Timm on the first animated Batman. I mean, the first really good one, anyway.
Besides the Lego one, yeah.
Well, this predates that. Alan basically pitched the name Darkwing, and I immediately loved it. And we had people submitting pages and pages of names, and it wasn't even close. There was not a second runner-up. You just had Darkwing, and I said, but we have to add Duck to it, because Darkwing, that kind of adventure name, is what he thinks he is, but Darkwing Duck adds the silly part, which is part of the comedy. Because back then this is before Aladdin. So there were discussions of, from executives saying, "What do you mean he's going to look at the camera or, do that kind of?" If, they actually, one executive said, "Look, if you can drop a safe on him and he survives, how do you have any jeopardy in the show? Like, how do you cut to a commercial and want to get the audience to come back?" And I said, "Well, when he's in real danger, we play scary music and he acts scared." And it worked. We actually had, the characters would get in trouble. You worried about Goslin and all of that. It all worked. And, and it was still goofy, and people were entertained. That was the main thing. And I've always said the difference between Darkwing and DuckTales is in the DuckTales universe, you drop a safe on Scrooge, you end up with a mess on the sidewalk. If you
Yeah.
drop it on Darkwing, the door is going to swing open of the safe and he's going to walk out like an accordion. That was just the difference in how he treated things.
Yeah.
Um, that was cool. I mean, again, my two highlights of my career were Darkwing Duck and the animated Hellboy movies.
Hmm. Well, I became introduced to Darkwing Duck through again, that was a little bit before my time, but I remember having a VHS tape of Christmas episodes of Disney shows. There was Goof Troop and there was Darkwing Duck, and that's kind of how it's like I did watch Goof Troop when I was a kid a lot, even before seeing that. But Darkwing Duck I had never watched, but I do remember what you were saying about Goslin, she's the kind of person that always wants to tag along. And that's what I thought of her, watching this. But I always thought she was more so a troublemaker.
Well, she is. I mean, it is her nature to get into trouble. So
Yeah.
it's just that she was, and she was always in over her head. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to tag along and do a great job. I mean, it does show you what, you know, everybody accepted Batman and Robin. Robin was supposed to be 9 years old. It's like, I'm going to be fighting the most ruthless criminals, these murderous scum. You know what I need is a 9-year-old kid. None of that makes sense, but it was a conceit that started back in the golden age of comics, and just people accepted it because they wanted kids to, watch it, to pick up the magazines.
I think my favorite gag or joke from Darkwing Duck was kind of talks a little bit about what you were saying about giving your stuff to companies. It was the episode where he tried to make a comic book out of his own adventures, and
one of my favorites too.
Yeah,
no, actually, it started out with, we didn't explain it, but there was a comic company doing a Darkwing comic, and he was angry that he didn't get a cut, and then they were making him look like a coward. So he took over the writing of it.
Yeah, but my favorite thing, or one of my favorites that came out of that, was Mrs. Muddlefoot changing it because she's like, thank you, Beaky. Yeah. I mostly remember Herb Muddlefoot, but Beaky was reading it, and she's like, Binky. Okay, yeah. But anyway, so she was.
I mean, a small point, but Beaky isn't as funny as Binky. That's how we make greatness.
Okay, for some reason I heard it as Beaky, but I can picture the character in my head. But Binky's reading it, and she's like, God, this is so violent. And so she changes it, and it's like, Mr. Bunny went up to Robin Redbreast and said, and it's Darkwing Duck's voice, "Would you mind getting out of here? You don't want me to lose my temper, do you?" And finally, he gets it done, and he's like, maybe I'll just sell this to Disney. Might even get a TV series out of it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I enjoyed that episode a lot. I mean, I enjoyed the episode where we played with the format. And at one point, somebody puts a coffee cup down on the comic artwork, and in the adventure, they run into a giant cup of coffee.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, because I did the one rule I had. I grew up with Silver Age comics, which were some of the silliest comics. So that was the era of Jimmy Olsen turning into a giant turtle boy, and and the Flash becoming a gorilla or old or a marionette or something. And there wasn't really continuity that came in with Marvel when they started. So you were constantly resetting, the thing. So we took a lot of liberties with Darkwing, and I just chased what I thought was the most entertainment. And in fact, Darkwing is famous for doing, I am the bubble gum that sticks to the bottom of your shoes, and that sort of thing.
I am the little mouse that eats your cheese.
Exactly. And he never used to do that. Now, early on, he didn't. He had one thing he said, I am the shadow that flaps in the night. I am the something that pecks at your nightmares. And luckily, it was just like the third script. It was a show where, by contrivance, Launchpad had to pretend to be Darkwing Duck, and Launchpad could never get the line right, so he would screw up, and he said, "I am the road salt that rots the underside of your car." we thought it was hilarious. And I said, that's too hilarious not to use. And we went back and rewrote. I had all the editors rewrite their any script that was, done to include that gag, because it was like, no, we can't make it a one-time launchpad thing. That's Darkwing always did it, and it's one of the things he's most famous for. Likewise, or similarly, anyway, we did an episode where ray that Megavolt creates splits Darkwing into a good half and a bad half. And at the end of that episode, both played by Jim Cummings brilliantly.
Oh yeah.
At the end of the episode, I love Negaduck. I'm telling you all, go ahead, use Negaduck again. And at first they said, but it's the same story if we're constantly splitting them. I said, no, I don't split them. We'd have Posiduck. And I said, no, nobody likes Posiduck. You like Negaduck. And they said, here's how I ran the show. They said, how do we explain that Negaduck comes back? And I said, you don't. You just go ahead and do it. And that's how I ran the show. And that's where we had some of the brilliant stuff, because we didn't worry about the little things. Now, years later, after decades of Marvel and then DC continuity and all shows on TV suddenly having arcs to every season, and the animation arcs too, fans cobble together their own version of continuity, which is fine. I think that adds a layer of entertainment, that I never planned for. But when they talk about the origin of Darkwing, I never gave him the straight origin. He had like 6 origins in the show or more. Fans point to the one where he went to high school with Megavolt, and they say, well, that's canon. That's how he did it. I said, no, it's just the one you like the most. It's completely different from this origin over here, where Darkwing inspired his past self when they were fighting a rock and roll criminal. So, I mean, again, it was a different thing. In the new DuckTales, they were much more continuity oriented. And when they introduced Darkwing there, I thought they did a brilliant job of setting up a series that they never got to do.
Mm-hmm. A couple of years ago, I actually met Jim Cummings, and I went up to him, and I are you familiar with the D23 Expo?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I went
been to it at least once. Yeah.
Okay, I went to one, and Jim Cummings was there, and I said to him, I want you to know I grew up with you on House of Mouse, Goof Troop, Winnie the Pooh, Darkwing Duck. You're a big inspiration to me. And he looks at me and he says, stay dangerous, like as Darkwing Duck, which I really wish I video recorded that. I could be like, could you do that again?
Yeah. No, he was brilliant. I've said this at several conventions and online. Jim Cummings was not always the voice of Darkwing. If you lived in Russia, you had a different voice. If you lived in Italy, you were listening to a different voice. But Jim Cummings, along with Ginny McSwain, who was our voice director, the two of them worked back and forth. Jim would come up with something really unique, and 2 episodes later, there'd be a similar thing, and Ginny would remind him of it. Like he did, Darkwing does this flattened kind of voice, when he's hurt. And, he did something different 3 episodes later, and Ginny reminded him, no, do that flattened thing. And together they kind of crafted this this performance. And that's the performance that then the writers, it's so much easier to write once you start hearing the voices, because now you have something in your head. So there is this beautiful feedback loop going on. So even though, Darkwing's voice was dubbed into different languages, Jim's performance was a huge part of the creation of Darkwing Duck, as we did that, those episodes.
Right.
So he's a great guy. Plus, obviously, the voice of Winnie the Pooh and Tigger and Monterey Jack and a million other voices.
Yeah, and one of the
on my shows.
Yeah, and one of the funniest guys I've ever met. He made me laugh.
He's fantastic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you also created the TV versions of Aladdin and Hercules after the films. What was that process like for both those shows?
It was uncomfortable for me
Oh,
because I had started for, I mean, at first, and then I just accepted what it was. I think the first time Disney did it was Little Mermaid was done first as a Saturday morning show,
okay.
and then after Darkwing, I felt I had with Chip and Dale, I felt like we got like 70% of what we wanted ended up in the show. And I'm not talking about, oh, we're censored or anything. I just mean the animation wasn't snappy enough, or we didn't get the situations right, or, you know. And then with Darkwing, I felt like that percentage was much higher. And it's like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. And I pitched a science fiction show, um, which everybody on the staff loved, except for the boss, who had to say yes to get it to Michael and Jeffrey.
Right.
Um, so I had created a whole pitch on my own of 30 cards or so, but you know, I never got to present it. Anyway, he took him on soon after, and I thought, oh, I'm going to get a chance again. Maybe do I, you know? And it was instead, it was asked me to do Aladdin because of my feature background. Well, remember, I used to share an office with Ron Clemens. For a while, I was his in-betweener, sadly, because I was terrible at in-betweening. Um, and so I knew Ron and John very well, and it was like they're feature guys, and there's no way I can do quality like that, you know, because I was hung up on, unlike Michael Eisner saying you just have to be your goal is to be the best on TV, not matching what features does. But still, I started with features, their feature characters and all that. But you know, Ron and John had no problem with it, you know, and we went in and just started doing the show. What really appealed to me is that the show was always 22 minutes long. Well, like Chip and Dale or Darkwing. And I was way more comfortable with that. And some of the episodes that really were more mythological or, you know, really told a sweeping adventure were my favorite ones. But the main thing is we had to, I made two calls. One that, and we could have just done it. It wouldn't have been a big deal, I'm sure. But I didn't want Aladdin to be this guy in the palace. I didn't want this to be the adventures of a married couple. I had to find an excuse to have Aladdin be a street rat. And the other thing I wanted was, if you take Genie out of Aladdin, the funniest character, bar none, is Iago the parrot. I said, I want Iago with the heroes because that's going to be hilarious friction. I don't need a parrot villain in every episode, but I want him part of the team. And he and Abu ended up being a very funny comedy team. So those are the two major things. Well, explaining that is what we had to do in our opener. And what our opening story was always 4 to 5 episodes of a continued story that we would then cut together as a movie. It would show on Friday nights. And this is in syndication. So on Friday nights, you'd have hype for this big movie that they'd say it plays vertically, meaning it played on a chart. It would be from 7 o'clock to 9 or whatever, with commercials and all that. And then it would be broken up back into episodes and become part of the 65 episode package. When I did that, our budgets were starting to be cut for our shows. And I just, especially on that show, I just felt like I got to keep the budgets up high. So I spoke to some people in direct home video. I said, you know, technically this is the sequel to Aladdin. You think you want to put this out on video? And all I was doing was hoping for another revenue stream to come in that would be the excuse not to shrink the budgets. Actually, at that time, they weren't interested in. Then they put Aladdin out on video. Huge hit, made giant numbers for them. I called the same guy again. I brought it up again. And this time there was interest because suddenly it's like, well, this Aladdin thing, there's more Aladdin. Well, we cut it down. We showed it to Jeffrey, and the first half was animated by our Australian studio, who were just brilliant animators in an American tradition, as opposed to the Japanese studio, also very good, but the sensibilities of Japanese animation is just different. You know, It came naturally, especially for the broad genie gags. So the other thing is we started with a Howard Ashman, Alan Menken song, Arabian Nights. We used basically the stanzas that they didn't use, talking about thieves and whatever. And the third thing that happened is there was Paul Felix, who became a concept artist at Features, but he did these beautiful layouts of and storyboards of horses galloping across the desert. And they had an animator in Australia who specialized in that, loved that. So when we showed it to Jeffrey, the opening sequence is one super animation by this Australian guys, looked beautiful because it was basically a night sky and sand dunes, and this beautiful song, that he was used to hearing. And he was amazed at how good it looked, and that kind of goodwill carried us through, even through more of the weaker stuff. So that ended up being Return of Jafar, and made video history. When they released it, it made a huge amount of money and created an entire, division. That basically at one point, because the head of Features at the time, Peter Schneider, did not like the idea, understandably. And, he was always speaking in Michael's ear about maybe not doing those. And I guess I wasn't at the meeting, but Michael, as these things were pitched, Michael said, should we be doing these sorts of things? And then they told him how much money it made. And he said, so how many others do we have lined up? Because again, this may be apocryphal, but I was told at the time, Michael Eisner came on with Jeffrey and the new executives and basically woke a sleeping giant. Disney had all this culture and creations that they still treated it as this little tiny studio. Me and Ron Clemens and Randy Cartwright, who did the carpet, we would used to go up into the walkways, the catwalks of the sound stages, and throw super balls off just to see how high they'd bounce, because they weren't using the sound stage. They were using them to store 16 millimeter educational films. It was ridiculous. They didn't even rent out the sound stage. So they came in and just did logical stuff. Create more movies. It's a real movie studio. We're going to put the movies on videotape, new industry. Yes, animation is going to go on videotape. And so the company profits were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And a bunch of executives, I guess, as profits went up, got bonuses, whether they had anything to do with those profits or not, because the company was more and more successful. Well, evidently, what I was told is this would have been the first quarter where they wouldn't have gotten bonuses. I mean, the company was doing great. It's just that, unless you discover another planet, you can only spread, well, they found a way to spread out farther after that. But, it's just the growth is going to slow. So no one expected their bonuses. Well, then out of nowhere, the profits from Return of Jafar came in, and all these guys got bonuses again. And they even got written up in business magazines saying, this is the thing of Disney. You out of nowhere, they'll create something brand new with their storytelling and all that. So I have mixed feelings about it. Some people say that, and maybe it would have happened anyway, because Universal was certainly, with American Tail, putting out animation on video. But people say, like, well, that was part of what hurt 2D animation, because it was everywhere. People didn't need to go to movie theaters to see it. They went to movie theaters to see CG films. You know what? Who knows? I don't argue against that. I think that's a possibility, but it was a major changing point. I don't know that our budgets went up or anything, but suddenly it was a whole new creative outlet for people to do, and ultimately they got better and better with it. If you look at the direct home video Return to Neverland, which is in theory a Peter Pan, well, it was a Peter Pan sequel. It's a beautiful film, and
oh yeah,
really
absolutely
stunningly done. stunningly done and a great story and emotional, and it starts in World War II, as I remember it. I mean, it's just fantastic. Um, and in fact, a lot of that, the technical side got better and better and better, but the stories weren't necessarily up to snuff, and that was one where it really hit well. That I
So
had nothing to do with. I just admired from afar.
so basically the Aladdin sequel, like the Return of Jafar, the home video sales being successful, that's basically what prompted the TV series.
No, the series was in production. We were
Oh, okay.
already going to do this. We were already doing the Return of Jafar as just this, sales gimmick on, to watch this thing on Friday, bring in extra eyeballs, and then to say, and Monday the series starts, and you'd show a commercial of a bunch of new adventures.
Okay.
So yeah, it was again just me, reaching out and just saying, is there interest in this? And again, I had no inkling of what would happen with it. And it was, and frankly, the huge sales, were based because Aladdin was so fantastic, the original movie. So
Mm-hmm.
people bought a sequel. They weren't making a judgment on animation quality because they were buying a box with a picture of Aladdin on it. It was the fantastic thing that Ron and John did with Howard Ashman and the whole crew that really, propelled that tape. I'm under no delusion that, it was the tape itself. Now, the second, I always think of it as a second sequel, but people, I guess, now call it Aladdin 3. Aladdin and the King of Thieves was different. We were able to put more into it. We were pretty much through production when we got Robin Williams to come back and do the genie. So that meant we reanimated things. I was also smart enough that instead of, it was still done by the Australian studio and our Japanese Disney studio. But instead of just saying, you're doing this half and this half, I gave certain sequences to Australia. Basically, anything that was genie heavy or song sequences generally went to Australia. And Aladdin and Japan did like the big finish where it's a lot of spectacle of, this temple being turned to gold and all that, which worked out much better for the show. And basically is seen much better, received much better, I feel, by the fans.
So
Although I
what
talk to a lot of people now at conventions where people grew up with the Return of Jafar and where I still cringe at it, they love it. They've watched it over and over wearing out tapes because they were the right audience to watch it at that time.
So what was Robin Williams like?
Oh, he pretty much, you've seen him. I mean,
Oh
he was
yeah.
just a great guy. We only recorded him. We got it all done in just a few days. We went up to San Francisco, where he lived close to, and he might have been putting it on, but I've never seen a person react so drastically to caffeine. There was a day where he was just kind of slowing down, and they hadn't had the coffee, and people ordered it, hadn't come yet, and then he got it, and suddenly he was on again. The only other time I saw a person, it wasn't about caffeine, it was just a note. I'm blanking on her name from Friends. Lisa Kudrow did the character of Venus and or Aphrodite, I should say. And she came in, and usually our voice director, Jamie Thomason at the time, always had a thing he would say at the beginning. He says, we always want to record the script, but if you want to improv a little bit or do something like that, record the script and then we can play. And for whatever reason, he did not say that at the front of that. And that I didn't do anything at the time, but it clicked in my head. And Lisa's performing her role. I'm going, just missing something. This is not the person I'm seeing on TV and all that. And then I gave her that note, and Jamie went, oh, what? I didn't say that. And then he gave it again. And man, from then on, she's an improv genius too. I mean, in a different way than Robin, but really the script just went up in a much higher level because of, just a super talented person, being let loose.
And
So those
last
things I
year,
always connect in my mind, you know.
and last year we also lost another one of the Aladdin cast members, Gilbert Gottfried.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
And Gilbert, the first time he recorded from New York on a digital patch. So
Right.
we'd be in a conference room, hearing it on a phone. Um, and when he first came on, I was like, is this the right guy? Because he was just a soft spoken guy and all that until we became Iago. And then it was this hilarious, and, he was just a lot of fun to work with. I didn't get much FaceTime with him. Every once in a while, he'd be out in LA for something. But he was just, I mean, he did everything I wanted the character to do, the guys wrote toward him very well. And, he always, it created great story situations having those two characters together.
Mm. Sadly,
And
I
we
never
actually
got.
used a lot of the original voices there. Aladdin was Scott Winger and Linda
Right.
Larkin did Jasmine. Those are the voices out of the features. And Jonathan,
Right. I was just about to
the
say
John
that
Singer
I've
does Jafar came back. Yeah.
Jonathan Freeman. Yeah.
Oh, I was right. Okay.
Yeah.
I
I
was
was just gonna.
starting to say it. I didn't trust myself.
Yeah, Jonathan Freeman. I'm a member of Galaxy Con, and the Aladdin cast of Scott and Linda and Jonathan, they were doing virtual meet and greets. I got a meet and greet ticket for Scott and for Linda as well. And I didn't get one for Jonathan because those tickets aren't that cheap, but I definitely knew I wanted to meet Scott and Linda. And I have to say, Linda is actually one of the sweetest human beings I have ever met. Like
Yeah.
that
And
soft
one thing,
voice that Jasmine has, I see in her
Mhm.
basically. Like so much.
One thing we used to do with our shows that are not done, it's very rare, if ever, that they're done this way, but we would have, uh, there's a taping I did of it that's online if you search through YouTube or something, or on my Facebook page, I guess. Um, it we would try to get all the cast together in the same recording booth. And then if certain people weren't having an act one, they'd sit out in the lobby and eat Oreo cookies or whatever it was on the craft tray. Um, but that really let the actors bounce off of each other. And I remember Linda, it was rare that she and Scott were out together because one of them, I believe, wasn't in California. But Linda, especially, I always remember she loved having the people there because she would really act across her, excuse me, her podium, just like reaching out, and just gesturing and all that, because it was real acting. I mean, voice acting is acting.
Oh yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Anyway, so was the Hercules series kind of like done in a similar way, like with the creative process?
The funny thing about that is that Ron and John were shocked that we did the young Hercules. They said, we created Superman. Why didn't you just do a Superman series? And basically, because the adult Hercules had been through his big story arc. And it's hard to write for Superman. I mean, Batman, write day and night, but to do a truly good Superman series, it's just really hard. You have to have the right hook to it and all that. But we pitched basically opening up the middle of the movie that gets skipped over is here's a kid, before he's come into all his full powers, where he doesn't know what he can do and he's unsure of himself. Uh, and then finally, we got the show greenlit, but then the head of the department, who at that time was Dean Valentine, said, "You don't have a show yet." And we're going, "What do you mean? Just, Michael Eisner, just don't create a show. We got a show." But it wasn't. It had the components, but it didn't have the high school aspect to it. And that took it to a whole new level, saying, "Oh, it's a high school show, but it's populated by gods and goddesses, or their offspring or whatever." And that really was a great hook. So his adventures weren't just random adventures; they were going in and out. And creating Icarus and Cassandra were just that was so much fun coming up with new characters to be his sidekicks that are also kind of the outcasts of the class. Um, so I mean, that's one of the best looking shows, that I've done. And Mark uh, McCorkle and Bob Schooley um, were key in making that show. They were the head story editors, and they could really write well for specific cast because that had a lot of, you know, it wasn't name casting because when kids watch a TV show, they don't care, unless you've got whoever the current teen idol is. Um, the voice is doesn't mean anything. It's the performance, it's the animated character they care about. But these are still voice acting is acting, and if you've got a great actor or you've heard that he's worked well before with just voice, we tried them out and got in. Um, and they just Mark and Bob were excellent at writing, for that. Of course, later on, they also were the head and were my co-executive producers on Buzz Lightyear. After that, they did another high school show, called Kim Possible, which is,
Yes.
was a fantastic show.
Oh
Has had at
yeah.
least one live action movie. There was talk of another, I think. So,
Oh, okay.
well, I mean, back then, I don't know how many they did for Disney Channel. I didn't know whether it was one or two,
Out of
but
the live
whatever. I
action
mean,
ones, there's just one. Yeah.
oh, okay.
There were a couple
Anyway,
of animated
that was
ones
a,
that they did in between.
oh, okay. I mean, they just did a brilliant job. Those guys were so, funny and actually it was Buzz Lightyear that it wasn't acrimonious. It was like Buzz Lightyear was a show for the first time in the history of TV animation. The same creative team that did one show went and did the next show. Usually you have somebody else do that because you're working on one show. In this case, it was Hercules. And then you would have time to recoup and rest and develop your next show. But instead, for whatever reason, it was decided that we would do the Buzz Lightyear show. And what I tried to get Mark and Bob to do is look, you have to pretend that on Fridays it's Buzz Lightyear Day. And that's what we have to work at. And it has to be arbitrary because there's always more work to do on a show. But Hercules, they were such a central part of that show in terms of story and character and the tone and all of that. I could never get them to do it. And I started doing early development and came up with a lot of the characters and kind of a universe thing. And then they finally got off of it and looked at it. They had to make it their own. And it was like, I was actually being too, strangely, from the guy who created Darkwing, I was being too logical with things about the shape of the ship. And I thought, what if there's just like 7 planets? You make each planet like, here's Vulcan, here's the Klingons and all that. And each of those planets have a distinguishing characteristic. And you would know, oh, if I put a Klingon and a Vulcan together, there's going to be friction. Or here's the hippie planet. We give them, that you could then come up with just 5 stories of each of those planets, and that would be enough to boom, you'd have your 65 episodes. But that wasn't clicking with them. And again, why start out with limitations? And so I got a lot of visual stuff started, but really it became, again, they were head of story and I pitched premises. I had to prove premises too, but, we never had fights over them, but I realized that what I loved about animation, TV animation, my career there, was storytelling. And basically they were in charge of the storytelling on Buzz Lightyear. And I said, I need a show where I can do that. And that's why I then went on to do the Team Atlantis show that didn't get made. So, but we had great scripts.
With the Buzz Lightyear show, of course, that was a big part of my childhood. Being, Toy Story 1 was one of the first, might have been even the first movie I ever watched with my eyeballs. I was like very, very little, like maybe 9 months old when Toy Story 2 came out. So I didn't get to see it in the theater at the time, but it's probably the movie I've watched the most out of any movie in the whole world. And, Buzz Lightyear, Star Command, That was that was a huge part of my childhood. How did that show come about?
Well, I mean, geez, I don't remember literally, other than every time a movie comes out, everybody says, "Can we get a show out of this?" I forget how it started. Other people had done development on it. There was
Okay.
artwork generated and all that. So before I was connected to it, um, so somebody had made the decision we should do a spin-off show of Buzz Lightyear. Uh, what we looked at was again, this is after just Toy Story, not Toy Story 2 or any of the others.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
Almost all of Buzz Lightyear's humor in that first movie is him being a fish out of water. He
Right.
thinks he's a space guy in a world that isn't space. You know, he talks about the evil Emperor Zurg and there is no such thing and all of that. Uh, so how are we going to do a show where he's a space guy and keep his humor, because now he's a fish in water? He is a space hero and all of that. Um, so that was more of a sensibility to keep the humor, but um, we treated him as he is this famous hero, and this ragtag group of cadets that he had with him uh, created a lot of stories and personalities that give us that humor and all of that, and all the science fiction stuff we had fun with, of course. So that was the difficulty of it. And this is all knowing that John Lasseter had always talked about Buzz Lightyear being you know, as if the toy was based on a animated adventure show like Space Ghost or something like that. So very straight laced. Well, we weren't doing that. Our goal was to, no, we have to somehow capture the humor or at least sensibilities of Toy Story, not the show that in your head he's based on, which would have been a straight adventure show. You know, we could have done that, but we weren't allowed because that was not the marching orders that we had. The other thing is because I will say, I mean, I know John Lasseter. I know him back when we were both at Features. John didn't have a lot of experience in television, so ultimately, I think he was disappointed with the series. And part of that is television has to work at a crazy pace versus features. That when you look at the beginning of, I think it's Toy Story 2 or 3, whatever, it starts with the Buzz Lightyear adventure.
Yep, that's Toy
And you
Story 2.
see, yeah, okay. And you see that's the show John has in his head. Well, it's like, how many months did you spend on that sequence? We have to turn out that script usually in like 8 weeks. From what if Buzz went to the moon of green cheese and, you know, Booster ate it, or so, you know, whatever the premise was, to a finished script that has to get recorded is like 8 weeks. And if it wasn't perfect at least at Disney, if it wasn't perfect at that time, it still had to go. You don't get to like, well, let's, you know, there used to be a lot of publicity on various features about, oh, and then we hit a meltdown. We had to scrap everything. It almost became a part of every movie's backstory. Well, we didn't get to have meltdowns. We had them behind the scenes, but you know, we had to turn out the product. And now when I, you know, visit the guys at TV Animation, it's like, no, they scope out, the writers start before the crew is there, and they're working out arcs to the stories they're going to do, and they have planning sessions and all of that. And even back then, in the early days of TV Animation, you know, some of my guys like Alan Burnett, but other guys on my crew would go to Warner Brothers and write there, and then come back, and you know, you may think there's a rivalry between studios, but the artists and the writers, they were constantly working for different studios depending on their contracts. Well, I found out that on Tiny Toons, I think, um, they were allowed to throw out X many scripts, and my jaw dropped. I said, "You get to throw out scripts?" It was like we never had that possibility. Like I say, it gets to the end, that script has to go. You try to make it as good as you can, and then as it goes through storyboarding, you're still trying to plus it in storyboarding and certainly at the recording sessions and all of that. But the idea that, this isn't quite up to our standards. Let's let's put it aside. Maybe we'll come back to it. That was just not something we were allowed to do. So, it was a different world. It's a much better world now for creators.
Right. And you brought up
Although they might not know it at the time. No, go ahead.
Yeah, you brought up Booster on Buzz Lightyear Star Command. And for any of the listeners who don't know Buzz Lightyear Star Command, first of all, watch it. This was a show. This is a really, really good show. If you're a Toy Story fan who's just been introduced to it by like Toy Story 3 and Toy Story 4, watch Buzz Lightyear Star Command. It's kind of like
although that's kind of hard to do. It is not on Disney. The show is not on Disney Plus.
But it's probably, you could probably find clips of it on YouTube somewhere.
Yeah, I think you can.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to hunt for it, but it's not that easy to find.
Yeah, but it's definitely
our do DVDs still exist? I don't know. But we did do the cool thing about Buzz Lightyear that we got to do is when we started it and gave the first production report to Michael Eisner, we pointed out, because the sequel had been announced, we said, this is going to come out before the sequel. And he was kind of in the whatever mood, saying like, doesn't matter, just go ahead. Well down the line, as we're in production, we had another meeting with him, but there were different executives in the room. I forgot who it was, but a guy said, this can't come out before the sequel, because you take all the impact of having more Toy Story adventures away from the features and all that. And Michael totally forgot his last meeting and said, yeah, we can't do that. So we were allowed to just stay in production. And the fantastic thing about that, instead of having somewhere in the middle have to come up with what's the movie story that's going to launch the series that explains how these characters got together, we didn't have to do that until the end. And what that meant is that instead of having to do all that designing and the backgrounds and all that and rush through them, we had the entire series of backgrounds, all of Star Command, all those backgrounds and layouts and character designs, they were all done. So all of our design budget could be just for new stuff for that movie, which became Buzz Lightyear of Star Command. And so that movie is really conceived as a movie, even though it was going to be divided up. But, we were able to put a lot more production value into it. And if you listen to the credits, you'll hear William Shatner sing, and he sings with among a chorus of space troopers or whatever. You'll hear the little green men singing, and that's me. I'm the voice of the little green men.
Okay, well, that's interesting. But I got to ask, because you brought up Booster, who, for the listeners who don't know, that's one of Buzz's sidekicks. You've got Mira Nova, Booster, and XR. And Booster was played by Stephen Furst. Now, for any of the listeners who don't know who that is, he was Flounder in the movie Animal House. And the reason I'm talking about Stephen is because when I was 9 years old, about 8 or 9, I get a call from my godmother who works in the film business. And she called me and she said, do you remember Buzz Lightyear of Star Command? I said, yes, I do. Very much, actually. She said, do you remember Booster? As it turns out, she was in the very room with Stephen Furst, and we got invited to the set to meet him. And like he even signed Buzz Lightyear of Star. He signed a DVD of Buzz Lightyear Star Command: The Adventure Begins for me. I should have brought it out here, but he wrote on it, to James from Booster and Stephen Furst, to infinity and beyond. And very sadly, a couple of years ago, Stephen passed away, and I was pretty sad about that, because I only ever got that chance to meet him once. And of course, having seen him on Animal House as I became a little bit older, I kind of realized, people really liked him for his humor. What was he like to you? because I just have that one memory of him, but I remember being so happy about it.
Well, he was just, I mean, all the guys were good. I mean, Steven fit right in with, actors you'd love to work with and have that sense of humor. And, they just listen to their conversations. They talk among themselves as you're like rewriting something in the control booth. They're great. And the whole cast was really good. Larry Miller, who did a good X-Hour, was actually done by two people because Larry Miller couldn't always, because of scheduling, make the recording.
Mhm.
And he was a maniac when it came to ad-libbing lines. So
Yeah, Larry Miller
I
was
loved
always like
X-Hour as
that
a
on everything.
character. Yeah, and he just added so much to that character, and again, when you hear that and have those tapes, you play them for the writers, even the stuff that gets cut out, and they get, they have a higher bar to meet uh, to get that. So, I mean, again, it was a fun team, fun group, and the only thing, I didn't like about the show is that I went, mentally after Darkwing Duck, I wanted to pitch a science fiction show, and I finally got to do one, but I wasn't in charge of story. I certainly had an influence on story, and I think I wrote a script, if not two.
Okay.
Um, the but that was just on a personal level. So, like I say, we did Team Atlantis, and we did, I don't know, 40 scripts of that, and that was, some of the best stuff. The staff was over the moon about that show, of what Disney had never done anything like what it was. I said, this is our X-Files, basically. Um, and sadly, luckily we got a few episodes in production when we were canceled because of the movie didn't do well. So they didn't want a spin-off movie
Okay.
or spin-off series. And we at least were able to cobble that together to do Milo Returns, or whatever that was called, when we did our Atlanta sequel on DVD. But that didn't. It has one of my favorite stories that I co-wrote, which is a very much H.P. Lovecraft, monster story. Um,
Right.
but it was just something entirely different for Disney to do, and sadly, no fault of our own. But there was no more syndication. Had syndication been a huge thing at the time, we probably could have continued in production. But it was going to go on one Saturday morning, which at that time didn't have any adventure into it. We thought it was going on a Toon Disney channel, which could have all sorts of animation style. Uh, but one Saturday morning was a very, at the time, Nickelodeon influenced thing with educational content, and we were doing basically a PG series action adventure, like the Atlantis movie. Um,
Mhm.
so anyway, that's sight unseen.
Mhm.
Great thing. But that I enjoyed, getting back in the story of Buzz Lightyear was just, I had plenty of influence on it. But
Mhm.
I'm just, Mark and Bob were just insanely funny. Just had lunch with them last week, actually.
Nice.
So,
Going back to Stephen first, my godmother knew that because I was a watcher of all this stuff, that I could imitate the voices of whatever character it was on TV, and she informed Stephen that I could do the voice of Booster. And I'm a 9-year-old kid who's talking to Flounder from Animal House, and so basically he says to me, "Give it let me hear it. Let me hear it." I don't know what the hell to do, so I'm like, I think I was like, I just want to be a space ranger so bad, Buzz. And he says to me, "You're better than me."
there you go.
Yeah, that's really some praise there, because that's his character. Did you
Mm-hmm.
actually see the Buzz Lightyear movie that came out last year?
Yeah, Lightyear, sure.
What did you think of it?
Well, it was okay as a movie. I didn't think it was gripping. Again, when and this has happened already to some of the shows I've worked in, where somebody, all the characters I created at Disney, I don't own. I have no
Right.
rights to them. I don't get anything out of it when they get re-released or um, rebooted. Um, and I knew that going in, so that I'm generally open when the guys on DuckTales pitched their version of Darkwing, I I wasn't giving them notes to make it like my Darkwing. It's like, no, I'm embracing what you're doing, and I thought some of the decisions they made were brilliant. Um, and so it's like with Lightyear, they made a creative decision. Um, and people wondered, well, where's Booster? Where's XR and all that? Well, that's not what it was about.
Yeah.
I just felt as a movie, it was kind of as I remember it, I haven't watched it, I think, since it came out. Um, it was just, I wasn't sucked in emotionally as I wanted to be at any Disney film.
Yeah.
Technically, obviously, gorgeous and all that.
Yeah.
Um,
Like I
so I
for
mean,
one
that's
thought that it was really, really cool. For like it really did feel like a science fiction action film. And I really did like that, especially being a Toy Story kid. So it gave me some nostalgia, but it isn't Toy Story.
yeah. And again, it wasn't meant to be. It wasn't.
Right.
So it was
That's what
it's
people
a
don't
strange
get. Yeah.
decision. I mean, I one of the last things I was almost on was I was supposed to do a series. This is just before my retirement. Um, was a Rocketeer series, um, and I pitched it for Disney Junior was putting me on it, and they said, and it was all sorts of things they couldn't do, and I said, okay, so basically, the marching orders are, it's got to be a kid. He has to wear a helmet and the
Of
jetpack
course. Yeah.
and has the name Rocketeer. And that's it. And they said, yeah. Well, again, I'm just saying, okay, great. I'm going to create a show. And I did a show that would have been wackier than Darkwing and hilarious, I think. But again, I'm too close. And I kept telling them, you guys have to pull me back. You have to give me notes. But that's not how they worked because they have such a house feel. They like to give creative people enough rope. I made use of it. And then that way they get, and I didn't know there were other people pitching their own shows. I kept expecting them to give me notes to say, no, 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 we don't want to go there. We want to come back and all that. And so instead, I just got to a point where I had done a sample script and everything. Um, they said, no, we're just cutting off. We're going with the other guy. And I didn't know there was another guy. So that was heartbreaking because it was like, ever since leaving Disney, all my projects had smaller and smaller budgets or tighter deadlines or whatever. Um, and this was a chance to go out on a Disney budget, which they considered, you know, low budgets. But from what I had been through, it's like, are you kidding? This is all the money in the world. Um, but the thing about it is, even more so than what they did with Lightyear, when fans would have been angry at me because I had a whole backstory. It was a different world. It was this family of aviators, and again, if Rocketeer never existed, it would have been a fine show. But basically, I took that as he was a kid. He had a jetpack. He had a helmet. And his name was Rocketeer, but it had nothing to do with the original movie and all that. So of course, it was the wrong thing to do. So even though it should have been a really cool show, had it been, there would have been riots in the streets, as far as Rocketeer is concerned. And Lightyear, I think people love Buzz in that Toy Story universe. And by intentionally doing something else, it is a 100% valid creative decision, much like I feel mine was. It doesn't mean it's the right commercial decision. I always quote Lily Tomlin said something through one of her characters who was like a Hollywood agent. She said, nobody calls it show art. And that's the message. It's like, at the end of the day, it's show business. It's a creative culture that ultimately has to be popular to make money. And with Lightyear, I think, I'm not even sure they could make a science fiction adventure that would make people accept it because it wasn't Toy Story and feel. I mean, so they did this amazing movie, but we'll never know. In an alternate universe, perhaps,
Yeah.
they did a Buzz Lightyear movie and was or was not successful. But
Mm.
um,
And apparently they're
again,
doing Toy
for me,
Story
just
5.
taking it as it is. Oh, I didn't realize that.
Oh
So
yeah, they're working on Toy Story 5, Frozen 3, and Zootopia 2. I mean, like I had heard that and I'm like, okay, Frozen, those are good movies. Zootopia's a good movie. Toy Story
one
5.
of those are Toy Story. That yeah, again, Toy Story is a Pixar film, so that is a different creative group, whereas the other two are Disney feature, you
Mhm.
know, creatives. So it's not that there is an overlap, because there is, but it's a whole different creative team. Even within the many creative teams they have, it features the overall is, hopefully has a slightly different sensibility than Pixar, because you want a little difference to it. And Zootopia was such a brilliant film,
Yeah, it
and
really
that
was.
that is the opposite of what I was saying of Lightyear. That film sucked me in. I felt for the characters, and it had twists in it, and you wanted to see more of those characters and the relationships between those characters. You know, that was just amazing. And Frozen is a huge commercial reason for doing it. Sold a lot of dolls and dresses
Sold a
and
lot of everything.
merchandise. But yeah, exactly. So you really, as you know, it really comes down to, do you have a story worth doing? Do you have a story that, regardless of whether it's on the same arc of the first two movies, it doesn't matter. But in that universe you've created with those characters people want to see again, do you have a story that makes it worth telling? Um,
Right.
by the way, I mean, it just reminded me of something. Fans always get concerned about reboots, and what fans of, well, like Darkwing, um, what fans really want to see. I mean, fans of the original show, it's very obvious that what they really want is the exact same show, just more episodes, and hopefully better quality of whatever,
Mhm.
Um, and that's not a reason to do a show business wise. If you're
Right.
Teenage Mutant Turtles, that sells huge merchandise. So all you have to do is, we're gonna make the turtles look a little different. Hopefully you still make a great movie. But that's why there's been so many turtle movies and turtle series, and the trailer for the new turtle movie looks incredible. I mean, it's like they're really treating them like teenagers, which is what they were supposed to be. They're Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it's like,
Right. Yeah.
wow, they're onto something there. So I can't wait to see that one. Um, so anyway, if you're going to do a reboot of the character, you have to say, what do we do to this to make it different? Because I wasn't connected to the project. Ultimately, I did a voice on it.
Hmm.
Uh, but I talked to the director of the Chippendale Rescue Rangers movie, Akiva Schaffer, or Schaffer, excuse me. Um, and he said, we were faced with, what are we going to do? We can't just reboot the series. And of course, they were doing a movie, not a series, but we're not just doing more episodes of the series, because that's what DuckTales did. And DuckTales, quality show, did not move the needle when it came to, the original DuckTales was a pop culture explosion,
Hmm.
and the reboot did didn't do that again. I don't know. Again, that's lightning in a bottle. Um, so they said, we can't just do. We're not doing more adventures of that. And there's companies that would, but they said, we're not going to be another DuckTales. Um, so they came up with the idea of the behind the scenes of the actors who played the Rescue Rangers. Um, a lot of fans, of course, wanted more episodes of the Rescue Rangers, and that could be brilliant too. Who knows? They could do that in the future. But creatively, what they did was fine with me, and I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was very funny. What they did. Um, so you've got to, whenever a reboot comes along, they really have to figure out, what's our reason for doing this. what's our reason for doing a series? Now movies are a little different because you can say, no, people are in this. We just have to find a great story, and it goes for Fast and Furious 17 or, whatever. If, uh, you've got, it's all about the story, but a TV series, it's a different kind of commitment. You've got to have a reason to do it because you've got so much competition. Movies always have competition, obviously, but in television now, in a world of streaming, and it's not just broadcast TV, it is, broadcast, streaming, movies that come out of theaters and then get put on streaming, so that's your competition too, in a way. You really have to have a reason to take a reboot, put it into production and all that. So that's what they're always searching for.
So let's wrap it up by talking about Hellboy. You said that was one of the best things you've ever done. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in it and your involvement with Hellboy?
Well, part of that was when I was doing Atlantis, Mike Mignola, creator of Hellboy, was an advisor on Atlantis, did a bunch of designs. They kind of designed the movie off his sensibilities. In fact, he said it was very weird that the first time he visited the studio, here's all these drawings on the wall analyzing his artwork and kind of saying, this is why this happens. And that's not how Mike thinks. It comes out of him. He just knows that there should be a line here. I need a shape here. And he's not even, it's like he's directly connected to a universe of creativity. It's not a logical A to B to C type thing. But they were trying to analyze it from the outside to do that. Anyway, because he was on that, I was a huge fan of him and a Hellboy fan. I was on Hellboy fan boards, back then. Here I'm doing the Atlanta show. That's my excuse to work with Mike Mignola. I worked with him. He designed monsters for our shows. At first, he read the scripts. He liked the scripts that he was reading. And then it was like, he said, I don't have time for this. Basically, just kind of tell me the story and what I need to design. Those would be the inspirations for, what then became the animated design of our monster of the week or demon or whatever we were doing. Then I came basically to the end of my career at Disney because I had a term contract and they were looking to cut money. And I'd been there so long, my salary was fairly high, but they didn't give me the option to say, we'll keep you on, but you're going to have to take a pay cut. I had something in development. Had it gone, I would have stayed at Disney, but it didn't. And as soon as it didn't, they extended me 6 months and then I was out the door. I didn't, because I was always a showrunner, I was always rewriting scripts and all of that. I didn't have like recent scripts to show as this is my work, because again, Mark and Bob were in charge of Buzz Lightyear, so mine would have dated, much farther back. Anyway, I asked Mike, he knew my situation. I said, do you mind if I write a couple of half-hour Hellboy stories just as samples, because people will be interested in reading them? Mm-hmm. And I did, and he gave notes on the first one. The second one, he says, I can't spend all this time doing something that's not going to get done. But ultimately, I left Disney. I had a couple of Hellboy sample scripts. I didn't have an agent, so I was trying to find an agent. I hadn't had one. I finally met with this guy, and he said, what agents always say is, tell me what you want to do. And usually you get that question and it means, I would like to direct, or I'm an actor and I want to get into writing, or, whatever it is. Well, I had already done all that. And I just said, you know what I'd like to do? I would love to do an animated Hellboy. And the guy got a big smile because he knew he had me, because it turned out he was the agent in charge of the merchandising of the Hellboy movies, Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy movies. Mm-hmm. And that he knew animation was part of what was going to be done ultimately. So when it came time for, they made a deal. It was going to be a series on Cartoon Network. Um, and when they were putting in development, it was like all these people had to sign off on it. They said, well, who should we get to do this picture? And everybody said my name except for the people who actually got the rights to do it. And it was like, who's Tad Stones? You know, they didn't, because I had, Cartoon Network knew me, and they, had liked my ideas there. Mike knew me, knew I was trying to be faithful to, his vision. Um, so it was very funny. And that's how I got involved in that. Um, again, we had many storylines just between Mike and me figured out, but then they couldn't make a deal with Cartoon Network and the other partners, because Cartoon Network was basically saying, "Hey, we're putting it on the air. That's worth this amount of money," and that, whatever. I wasn't part of any of the negotiations like that, so that went away. And instead, they said, "We're going to do a series of direct-to-video movies." And I remember we got that news at a San Diego Comic Con, and Mike and I were both taken aback because we had already been in this universe of individual episodes. And Mike was saying, well, I guess this is good news. And ultimately, it's great news. If you're going to do a whole line of movies, that's great. You can figure out how you want to do. Are they going to overlap? Does the story continue, and all of that? But budgets are very low. The movies had to overlap production. So, there was no learning curve. It wasn't like, okay, this is what I did right here, and this is what we did now. On this next one, we're going to course correct. We were kind of learning it on the go. And marketing, basically, the world was changing as far as how DVDs were put out in the world. I remember the meeting with these outside marketing guys who the question came up, do we publicize? Because Mike and I were set up to do all sorts of interviews and things like that in magazines and on podcasts and all that. And he said, do we market for the release of the video or when it goes on to Cartoon Network as a movie, which would be first? And they all said, no, it should be. And the marketing people said, well, because they were used to marketing real movies. So you market Indiana Jones 6, whatever, you've got that. All the publicity goes there. And then a time goes by and you put out the DVD and you reuse all that marketing. You just say, now, finally, it's here in your hands. The difference was they were so worried that, again, this is early on in DVD marketing. Sorry to get all business oriented at the end. They were so worried that if we put it on the air for free, then who's going to buy the DVD? So they only let Cartoon Network show it 2 times or something. And then there was this 3-month gap or whatever it was when it was on the DVD. Well, truth of the matter is, not that this was a kid project, but people see a movie they like, they buy the DVD. It doesn't ruin anything. That's when they want the DVD, especially now. It's like people are making decisions of, do I see the movie in the theater or do I wait 2 months to see it on, Disney Plus? Anyway, we did all this publicity push for the premiere on Cartoon Network. Cartoon Network didn't do any real publicity on it because all their publicity was reserved for their shows. Very little publicity. I mean, I'm talking about on the air commercials saying, hey, tonight, this is coming. So it didn't do much at all. And then by the time the DVD came out, well, we couldn't go out and redo all those interviews and all that. So it was like there were hardcore Hellboy fans who did not know the animated shows were out. So it did not do that well. We did 2 movies creatively. I'm very proud of them. Again, I look at them and I just see the stuff that I wish to do more. In fact, Kevin Hobbs, who's written many things with me, going back to Rescue Rangers, actually, Kevin said, "Oh, he wrote the script on that, with my input constantly on him." um, Kevin said, "Yeah, I really liked the movie." Well, until I heard the director's commentary and I realized it sucked, because I realized in my comments I was constantly saying, "Oh, we wanted to do this, we didn't quite get this." What wrong thing to say in comments? Uh, anyway, we got to write a third movie, which at this point, now I know what works, what doesn't work. We're going to actually attach the Hellboy origin to it. And the company sold their company to Stars Media, and Stars said, "We don't want to do animated movies." And that was the end of the Hellboy thing. But again, it took some daring. I mean, part of the second one, there are flashbacks that are actually going in reverse order than the main story. So creatively, we were just, that was fun in a whole different way than Darkwing and all that. I was doing, supernatural movies, which I loved, and not doing it like Scooby Doo, where you go in and say, "Whoa, this is a haunted house." It's like, no, you go into a house and then you show why they did, or how they discover that it's haunted and how scary it is and all that. And that was just a creative thing that, I loved. So wish I could do more.
Well, Tad, that's all I've got here. Is there anything else you want to say to finish?
No, I've said way too much already. You do edit, don't you? Feel free to edit anything boring and blabbering on.
Personally, I don't find you boring. I find you a person that definitely has a lot of stories, and that's what Nostalgia Talk is all about, getting nostalgic about the things that we love.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me on here.
Well, thank you for coming. And to all you listeners, stay tuned. We've got episode number 60 coming soon. For anyone wondering, recently I announced I was doing a little collaboration with Marty Robinson and Lou Berger, two past guests. As you probably know, the piece with Marty has been recorded. The piece with Lou will be recorded, and that'll be out later this month. And of course, just announced a new episode just this week. I don't know if that's going to be episode number 60, but the very next Nostalgia Talk will be episode number 60. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, happy Easter. Peace.